On the morning of April 18th, 1983, the water reached the porch before Margaret Hale finished her second cup of coffee. It wasn't rainwater. It wasn't spring runoff. It was a deliberate flood, creeping across 83 acres in Pemiscot County, Missouri, carrying broken fence posts, cattails, and the quiet confidence of men who believed they had finally driven a widow from her land. Margaret stood on the top step, wearing faded work boots that had belonged to her late husband, Daniel. She watched the current swallow another row of winter wheat, without saying a single word. Behind her, an old 1956 John Deere 420 utility, 28 horsepower, waited inside the machine shed with dried mud still packed beneath its fenders. Most people saw a drowned farm. Margaret saw water behaving exactly the way water always had. The Hale farm had never been large. 83 acres of bottomland bordered by a shallow creek and protected by an aging levee built during the late 1940s. Daniel Hale had purchased the property in May 1968 for $46,800, borrowing nearly every dollar from a local production credit association. It had taken 15 years of soybeans, winter wheat, and careful spending to own it free and clear. Daniel never lived long enough to enjoy that freedom. A heart attack claimed him during the soybean harvest of October 1981, leaving Margaret to raise their 12-year-old daughter, Emily, while running a farm that neighbors quietly insisted would soon be sold. Some offered sympathy. Others offered low prices. A few offered both. Let me tell you about Margaret Hale. She was 39 years old, far younger than the weathered farmers who usually fill stories like this, yet she carried herself with the same quiet patience. Her hands bore white scars from baling wire and hedge thorns. Her boots were always clean enough to respect the house, but muddy enough to prove she had been working before sunrise. She never hurried her words. She rarely looked away when someone challenged her. People often mistook her silence for uncertainty. They always discovered the difference too late. The trouble began 3 miles upstream. A development company called Riverbend Aggregates had leased hundreds of acres for gravel excavation to protect expensive equipment during heavy rains. Contractors raised temporary earthen berms that redirected overflow toward neighboring farmland. County inspectors questioned the practice, but paperwork moved slowly. Water moved faster. Each storm left Margaret's fields wetter than before. Then came April. By the second week, standing water covered nearly 20 acres. By the third, 40. The contractors insisted they had done nothing wrong. The insurance adjusters wanted photographs. The bank wanted reassurance. Only one person seemed completely calm. That was Walter Briggs. Walter was 72 years old and farmed the adjoining property his father had purchased in 1937. His back bent slightly when he walked, but his hands still closed around a wrench with surprising strength. His eyes noticed details younger men missed, like changing bird migrations or tire tracks that didn't belong. He arrived just after sunrise driving a faded 1949 Farmel M, 38 drawbar horsepower, purchased brand new by his father for $1,975 at a dealership in Caruthersville, Missouri. Walter had rebuilt its engine twice, replaced every bearing himself, and changed the oil every 100 operating hours without fail. The tractor sounded less like machinery than memory. Margaret met him beside the flooded fence. "They're hoping you'll leave," Walter said. "I know. They're betting you can't afford another season. I know that too." Walter looked across the rising water for nearly a minute before speaking again. "They've forgotten what this land used to be." Margaret smiled. "So have they." Neither explained what they meant. The answer had been buried beneath decades of ordinary farming. 3 days later, the county called a public meeting inside the Haiti courthouse. Contractors, landowners, bank officers, insurance representatives. Nearly everyone with something to lose crowded into the room. Among them stood Kevin Mercer, 34 years old, project manager for Riverbend Aggregates, fresh engineering degree, new pickup truck, expensive wristwatch, the sort of confidence earned from spreadsheets instead of seasons. He presented drainage maps, elevation surveys, rainfall averages. Then he pointed toward Margaret. "We've heard concerns from Mrs. Hale," he said. "Unfortunately, farming flood-prone ground always carries risks." Several people nodded. Margaret remained seated. Kevin smiled politely before adding, "Perhaps it's time to consider selling before conditions become even worse." A few chuckles drifted through the room. Then someone laughed. Another joined. Within seconds, the courthouse echoed with the kind of laughter meant to make a person doubt herself. Kevin didn't stop it. He simply folded his arms. Margaret stood slowly, smoothed the wrinkles from her denim jacket, looked directly at Kevin, then spoke so quietly the room leaned forward to hear. "If you're finished laughing," she said, "you might want to learn where your water is really going." The laughter faded, not because they believed her, because Walter Briggs had just unfolded a yellowed county survey dated August 1948, and every eye in the courthouse turned toward the brittle piece of paper as he laid it across the table. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The courthouse seemed to shrink around that faded survey. Walter rested both weather hands on the brittle paper, as though he were protecting something far more valuable than ink and parchment. The date across the top read August 12, 1948. Below it stretched a detailed drainage map prepared after one of the Mississippi River's worst post-war flood seasons. Every ditch, creek, slough, and abandoned river channel had been measured by hand. Kevin Mercer frowned. "I don't see what an old survey changes." Walter didn't answer immediately. He traced one crooked blue line with a callous finger until it reached Margaret's farm. Then he kept tracing. The line continued beneath what was now Riverbend aggregates. Finally he looked up. "It changes everything." The room grew quiet again. "Let me tell you about Pemiscot County in the late 1940s. Long before satellite maps and computer modeling, county engineers understood something modern planners often forgot. Bottomland wasn't simply flat ground. It remembered where rivers had traveled centuries earlier. Even after farmers cleared timber, leveled fields, and planted crops, the underground remained full of ancient sand channels and buried drainage paths. Block 1, and the water never disappeared. It merely searched for another way home. Walter pointed toward the survey. "This isn't just a creek," he said. "It's an old overflow channel from the Mississippi. My father helped clear brush here after the flood of 1945. Kevin crossed his arms. "With respect, Mr. Briggs, engineering has advanced a little since then." "It surely has. And our hydrology reports show no major concern." Walter nodded once. "I believe they do." The calmness in his voice unsettled people more than anger ever could. Margaret watched silently. She knew Walter wasn't arguing. He was waiting. Outside, another steady rain tapped against the courthouse windows. Inside, Insurance Representative Linda Cross leaned closer to examine the map. "The old channel runs directly beneath Riverbend's western berm," she observed. Kevin shook his head. "Our surveys never showed that." Walter smiled faintly. "No, they couldn't." "Why not?" "Because you measure the surface." He tapped the yellowed survey. This one measured history. The meeting ended without resolution. County officials promised another inspection. Riverbend insisted its barriers met every regulation. Margaret drove home without saying much. Walter followed behind in the Farmel M, its slow engine note echoing across soaked pavement. By evening, the water had climbed another 6 inches. Fence posts disappeared. Soybean ground became a shallow lake. Neighbors parked along the road to watch. Most believed they were witnessing the final days of the Hale farm. The next morning, Kevin arrived with 2 consultants wearing clean boots that had never sunk into Missouri gumbo clay. One carried rolled blueprints. The other carried a laser level. Margaret greeted them politely. "You won't stop us from inspecting." "I wouldn't dream of it," she replied. Kevin looked across the flooded acreage. "You still have time to sell." Margaret simply looked toward Walter's tractor parked beside the machine shed. Its faded red paint contrasted sharply against the gray sky. Kevin noticed, "That old farmer won't save this place." "No, it won't. It already did once." Kevin laughed softly. "I'd like to hear that story." "So would I," Margaret answered. Walter arrived before either could continue. Without a word, he climbed onto the Farmel M, started the 4-cylinder engine, and eased toward the deepest part of the flooded field. The consultants exchanged confused glances. "What exactly is he doing?" one asked. Margaret smiled. "Looking." The tractor moved slowly through water, nearly reaching its axles. Walter stopped every 30 yards. Sometimes he dropped a steel rod into the mud. Sometimes he watched floating sticks. Sometimes he simply sat still. Nearly 2 hours passed. Kevin finally walked toward him. This proves nothing. Walter climbed down. It proves plenty. I don't see anything. Walter handed him a muddy handful of sand. Exactly. Kevin stared. It's sand. It shouldn't be. He let the grains fall between his fingers. This field is mostly heavy clay. Kevin frowned. Walter continued. Unless water is rising through an old riverbed underneath. The younger man said nothing. For the first time since arriving, certainty left his face. Let me tell you about old floodplain soil. People often assume water only travels across the surface. Much of it doesn't. Ancient river channels leave deep layers of coarse sand beneath heavier clay. Sand acts almost like thousands of tiny drinking straws bundled together. Water moves through it quickly, building pressure beneath fields until it finds the weakest place to escape. Raise an artificial berm in the wrong location, and that underground pressure can force water upward far from where the rain actually fell. That's why farmers who know their land often understand floods better than people studying maps from an office. Walter had learned that lesson from his father. Kevin had never heard it before. Clouds darkened again. Thunder rolled across the county. Then a deputy sheriff's truck appeared at the end of the lane. He stepped out carrying fresh county orders. His expression suggested the paper in his hand would change far more than anyone standing there expected. He unfolded it, cleared his throat, and looked directly at Kevin Mercer before saying the first sentence. The deputy removed his hat before he spoke. By order of the Pemiscot County Commission, effective immediately, all additional work on the Riverbend Western Berm is suspended pending an emergency hydrological review. Kevin Mercer stared at the document. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. The project has state approval. It still does, the deputy replied, but the county believes new evidence deserves another look. Walter Briggs nodded once, not in victory, simply in acknowledgement. Margaret accepted the news with the same quiet expression she had worn all week, because the order didn't lower the water. It only stopped it from getting worse. By the following morning, nearly 60 acres of farm lay underwater. The machine shed stood on slightly higher ground, but only barely. The old 1956 John Deere 420 utility remained inside, its green paint dulled by decades of work, its steel seat polished smooth by thousands of hours beneath Daniel Hale. He had bought it used in March 1972 from a dealer in Kennett, Missouri, paying $2,850 after trading 2 beef calves and an aging pickup. Every winter he changed the fluids, packed fresh grease into every fitting, and stored it beneath canvas instead of leaving it exposed to weather. To anyone else, it was an outdated tractor. To Margaret, it was the last machine her husband had repaired with his own hands. She wasn't about to lose it. Neighbors arrived with flatbed trailers, chains, fuel cans. Nobody asked for payment. They simply started working. Even Kevin came back. He climbed out of his pickup, looked across the flooded fields, and quietly asked, "What needs moving first?" Walter handed him a logging chain. "The tractor." Kevin blinked. "I thought you'd tell me to save the combines." Walter shook his head. "The combines can be replaced." He rested one hand on the John Deere's hood. "This can't." For the first time since they met, Kevin didn't argue. The rescue took most of the afternoon. The John Deere refused to start after sitting in damp air for days, so Walter removed the spark plugs, turned the engine by hand, checked each cylinder, then cleaned the ignition points with a folded dollar bill. On the third attempt, the little 2-cylinder engine barked to life. Its familiar rhythm echoed across the flooded valley. People smiled without realizing it. Some sounds simply remind human beings that hope still exists. Late that evening, engineers in the county arrived with drilling equipment. Core samples confirmed what Walter had suspected. Less than 7 feet beneath Riverbend's western berm lay an ancient sand channel stretching hundreds of yards beneath both properties. Water pressure was building underneath it like air trapped beneath a blanket. One engineer removed his hard hat. "If this keeps rising," he whispered, "the berm won't hold." Kevin heard every word. His face lost its remaining confidence. He walked over to Margaret. "I owe you an apology." She looked toward the flooded fields. "Not yet." "You were right. That isn't enough." He understood immediately. Being right wouldn't restore drowned crops. It wouldn't erase months of worry. It wouldn't pay Emily's school expenses. The only thing that mattered now was fixing the damage. Have you ever known you were right when everyone around you insisted you were wrong? Not because you wanted to win an argument, but because you knew the consequences would fall on everyone if the truth was ignored. Moments like that don't feel satisfying. They feel lonely. Margaret understood that long before anyone believed her. 3 days later, the rain stopped. The pressure underground did not. County officials ordered controlled excavation along one side of Riverbend's berm. Bulldozers carved a narrow relief channel exactly where Walter had marked the old survey. Everyone waited. Nothing happened. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10. Then the earth shivered. A narrow stream burst from the excavation trench. It grew wider, then deeper. Within minutes, thousands of gallons of trapped water surged through the opening, rushing back toward the natural drainage route that had been buried for generations. Nobody cheered. They simply watched. The current flowing across Margaret's fields began slowing almost immediately. By sunrise the next morning, the water line had dropped nearly 18 inches. Another day later, rows of young cattails stood exposed where open water had been. Then something extraordinary appeared. Fish, hundreds of them. Crappie, bluegill, channel catfish. They had followed the floodwater into Margaret's fields through forgotten waterways, becoming trapped as the water receded. Walter smiled the moment he saw them. "I was hoping for this." Margaret looked at him. "You knew." "I remembered." "Remembered what?" Walter knelt beside a shallow pool. "My father told me the same thing happened after the flood of 1945. News traveled fast. Biologists from the Missouri Department of Conservation arrived to inspect the flooded acreage. What they discovered would transform Margaret's struggling farm into something nobody in that courthouse meeting had imagined. And when Kevin Mercer heard the state's proposal, he quietly removed his company hat before speaking. The conservation biologist spent 2 full days walking Margaret Hale's flooded fields with notebooks, measuring tapes, and sample nets. What they found surprised even the oldest residents of Pemiscot County. The temporary floodplain had become a nursery. Young bluegill clustered among the wheat stubble. Channel catfish moved through shallow pools left behind by the receding water. Aquatic grasses had already begun rooting in places that had been dry farmland only weeks before. One biologist estimated that thousands of juvenile fish had survived because the ancient overflow channel Walter remembered had briefly reconnected with the Mississippi floodplain. The state had been searching for private landowners willing to restore seasonal wetlands. Margaret's farm had become the perfect example. Kevin Mercer stood quietly as the proposal was explained. Rather than forcing the water away every spring, Margaret could voluntarily convert the lowest 22 acres into a managed seasonal wetland, while continuing to farm the remaining ground. Through a combination of conservation easements, wildlife habitat incentives, and carefully managed public access, the annual payments would exceed what those flood-prone acres had produced in soybeans for years. Nobody in the room spoke for several seconds. Then Kevin finally broke the silence. "So, the water wasn't destroying the farm." Walter smiled. It was reminding us what the farm used to be. Margaret signed the agreement on September 14, 1983. The first conservation payment totaled $28,600. Additional wildlife leases followed. Duck hunters reserved blinds each autumn. Local schools visited during spring migrations. Bird watchers arrived carrying binoculars instead of lawsuits. Within 4 years, the income from those 22 acres regularly outperformed the neighboring cropland that had once been considered more valuable. The people who had laughed in the courthouse now brought visitors to see the restored wetland. Many admitted they had been wrong. Kevin Mercer admitted it more openly than anyone. Let me tell you about Kevin after that flood. He remained an engineer, but he never designed another drainage project without studying historical surveys first. Younger employees noticed a folded 1948 county map that stayed inside his truck for the rest of his career. Whenever someone dismissed old farmers as stubborn or outdated, Kevin would quietly unfold that yellowed paper and tell the story of the widow who understood her land better than every modern report combined. He said it saved him from making the same mistake twice. Walter Briggs continued farming well into his late 70s. The old 1949 Farmel M never became a museum piece. It pulled wagons, mowed roadsides, started every winter. Its faded paint grew thinner. Its engine never lost its steady rhythm. People often asked why Walter refused to replace it. He always answered the same way. It still remembers how to work. Margaret never became wealthy in the way newspapers usually measured success. She simply stopped worrying about losing the farm. Emily graduated from the University of Missouri with a degree in wildlife biology in 1993. She returned home instead of taking a city job, helping expand the family's conservation programs while keeping the higher ground in wheat and soybeans. The Hale farm remained exactly what Daniel had hoped it would become. Not larger, not fancier, just secure. 5 years became 10. 10 became 20. Children who had once caught bluegill in the restored wetland returned with children of their own. The courthouse meeting slowly became local legend. The laughter was remembered. So was Margaret's answer. Have you ever watched someone turn what everyone else called a weakness into their greatest strength? Sometimes life doesn't reward the loudest voice or the fastest solution. Sometimes it rewards a person willing to understand what has been there all along, quietly waiting beneath the surface. Walter Briggs passed away peacefully in November 2002 at the age of 91. On the morning after his funeral, Margaret drove to his barn. She opened the doors, turned the fuel valve, pulled the choke. The Farmel M started on the second revolution. She let it idle for several minutes before driving it slowly across the property line one final time. No speeches, no ceremony, just the familiar sound of an old engine greeting another sunrise. Years later, visitors often asked about the faded tractor parked beside the wetland overlook. Emily never polished it, never restored it. She only maintained it exactly as Walter had, because every scratch belonged to someone. Every dent carried a memory. Every hour on its faded gauge had been earned honestly. Some people believe the Hale family became rich because the flood changed their farm. The truth was quieter than that. They became rich because they finally understood the value of the land they had owned all along. Some things that look like disasters are simply forgotten truths finding their way back to the surface. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly stood their ground while everyone else laughed, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Have you ever seen an old machine, an old farm, or an old lesson prove everyone wrong? Share your story. I read every one. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who refused to sell his abandoned windmill, only to discover it was hiding a fortune beneath its foundation nearly 30 years later, I hope you'll join me for that story too.